My documentary Here Comes a New Challenger, exploring and celebrating the legacy of Street Fighter II, is now available on Amazon Prime. The documentary delves deep into its creation, its port to the home consoles, the merchandise, the live-action movie, and more. For those who love physical media, you can purchase the Blu-ray from my Shopify store. The Blu-ray is region-free and includes special features. Follow the links below to check it out.
Interrupt from priority compartment.
As some of you know, a 337 model EEV crash landed here at 0600 on the morning watch. The survivor is a woman.
0700 hours, I received word from the network. I may point out this is the first high-level communication this installation has ever received, to my knowledge. They want this woman looked after. They consider her to be very high priority.
Why?
I have no idea.
Was there an alien on board?
Yes.
I haven't seen one exactly like this before, but the others were afraid of fire. We get something in there, there's no way it can get out.
Get here! Get that foolish woman back to the infirmary!
It started. Force it here, slam the door, and trap its ass.
This thing is really pissed off!
I'm telling you, I want to die!
We got a deal! Remember? It dies first, then you!
Alien 3.
In 1992, 20th Century Fox had big plans for Alien 3, wanting it to be their big movie of the summer season, throwing large sums of money into its production budget, totaling over $50 million, which was due in part to constant changes to its script and the final edit with a number of reshoots. A huge amount was pumped into marketing so everyone was aware of the film, from kids to adults, with merchandise being pushed more heavily compared to the other two films, with a Pepsi tie-in, t-shirts, comics, and in the centre of London at the Trocadero, Alien War opened, as a live experience with the public being chased by aliens as colonial marines escort the attendees to safety. And of course there was video games. The Alien franchise was more popular now than ever. Alien 3 would perform well at the box office, but it left many of the fans disappointed and underwhelmed with the direction it went, killing off Hicks and Newt from the get-go, and finding Ripley on a prison planet surrounded by bald men who were rapists and murderers. American audiences struggled to understand them due to their British accents and the film's overall depressing tone, with Ripley sacrificing herself at the end to kill off the alien queen in her chest, ending the franchise at the time on a downer. And a lot of the critics were very negative towards it, the complete opposite to Alien and Aliens. The director David Fincher had a horrible experience making the film, with constant studio interference and difficulty with the British crew at Pinewood Studios, resulting in him disowning the movie and refusing to talk about it at great length over the years. But for many kids and young teenagers, Alien 3 would be their window into the franchise, with the video game being the perfect opportunity for them to experience the horror and action the series was best known for. During the early 90s, licensed video games were very common, an easy way for many game developers to make a big profit. Ocean Software had been dabbling with licensed games since the 1980s, and had huge success with Robocop and Batman, and other publishers had followed suit. But not all of the games were good. Many were mixed in quality and seen as a cash grab from many of the video game critics, with them complaining, "Oh, it's another licensed video game." They were always expecting nothing original. It was easy for many people to spot a popular movie title on store shelves instead of looking for something more original. Thus, it made licensed games very lucrative. The Alien films had been licensed before, with Alien getting a game on the Atari 2600 and for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad. Aliens received an arcade game from Konami, along with a version on the MSX and 2 games on the micro home computers, with the FPS version being generally scary to play as a kid. Come 1992, the market had shifted from home computers to video game consoles, with Alien 3's appearance on the old home computers being limited, as gamers were more interested in the new consoles from Sega and Nintendo. Thus, they were the prime candidates to take advantage of the Alien 3 license. Mirrorsoft originally obtained the license for Alien 3, but the company went bust. So as a result, Acclaim swooped in and grabbed the license and additional assets, and gave Croydon-based company Probe Entertainment, along with Eden Software, the job to develop the game across all the gaming platforms, with Bits Studios handling the Game Boy version and Virgin Interactive publishing the Amiga version as a European exclusive. Fox had given the developers the script, which was not the final version, along with storyboards and photos to use as reference, but there was a problem. Alien 3 has Ripley face up against only one alien, and the film featured no weapons such as the fan favourites from Aliens such as the pulse rifle and smart gun. Ideas were thrown around from Fergus McGovern, the owner of Probe, and other key developers to adapt the script and to feature one alien. Tim Round of Eden Software, who was working on the game for the Mega Drive and Amiga, was interviewed for CU Amiga in September 1992 and said, "What would the player do if they encountered the lone alien? Run away?" Nick Jones, who was working on the SNES game, said he originally considered having a vast world with a single alien with a deep AI, but the designers really struggled to create a game that would be entertaining with only one xenomorph. It was finally decided that they would avoid the script as it threw up too many problems in making a game, and they felt gamers wouldn't want to play it if they stuck too close to the story. 20th Century Fox had to be persuaded to go in a different direction, as Probe made it clear players would find it more fun if they could use guns and kill many aliens. Fox agreed and thankfully didn't get too involved with the development and left the coders and designers alone in their attempts to adapt the film into a fun side-scrolling action game. But they did receive two rules from Fox: they couldn't show Ripley dying, and the actors' faces in the game had to be approved. Development would first start on the Commodore 64, which may surprise many of you. Mike Archer, who worked for Probe as a programmer, revealed in an interview for Reset Magazine, issue 14, discussing the C64 version, saying, "It's not a conversion, I helped with the design and it was a lead version of the title." As Mike was first on board the development team, the graphics and maps were first done on the C64 first, and then transferred to the other formats with the Amiga and Mega Drive, etc. So bizarrely, the Commodore 64 version would be the base model for all the other ports, despite it being the last version to market. Eden Software was founded by Stuart Middleton and Tim Round. The company's initial intent was to do conversion of Sega games, and the Amiga version of Alien 3 would be their first game for Probe Software. They would also port Robocop 3 from the SNES to the Mega Drive under the Flying Edge label. Tim Round would handle the majority of the port of Alien 3 by himself. In his interview for CU Amiga, he explained some of the difficult moments of implementing the tunnels for Ripley to crawl into, and the article shows some additional art assets that were never used for the prisoners, who once saved appear to run off or climb away to freedom. Bits Studios, who were handling the duties of coding the Game Boy game, had a copy of the script to work from, but didn't get a chance to preview the film. They were aware the other developers were going with a side-scrolling action game, and instead went with a top-down view in efforts to make their game stand out. Coder Jay Austin, who was interviewed for Retro Gamer in issue 196, said his experience coding for the ZX Spectrum made it easier for him to jump onto the Game Boy, as they both shared a Z80 processor. But the Game Boy had the advantage of hardware for scrolling and sprites. In August of 1992, the film got its theatrical release in the UK, and a number of the coders and designers got to attend a screening at the Leicester Square Odeon Cinema. Some of the developers had heard about the issues surrounding the film's production. Nick Bruty at Probe and Nick Jones of Spearsoft Entertainment would attend the screening and were assigned to work on the Super Nintendo port, and they were very disappointed. They loved the characters but felt it was such a glum movie and not an appropriate send-off for Ripley's character, as they discussed in Retro Gamer for issue 157. Working on the SNES was a big leap for Nick Jones and Nick Bruty, as they were used to working on the Commodore 64, which had little memory, but now they had 16 times more memory, multiple graphic modes and more colour. Jones would spend nearly 15 months writing the game. Reflecting on it years later, Nick Jones said he felt Ripley's jump was too floaty and wished they included a fight between Ripley in a power loader against the Queen alien, as once the final mission is complete, it just has a cutscene with the alien queen being pushed off a ledge, making little sense. The first game to be released would be the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis version in October of 1992. The game would be a straight-up action title as you run around endless mazes of corridors, climbing ladders and crawling into vents to save prisoners who have been impregnated by facehuggers. You're limited per level to save them in time before it's too late. Even if you save them all and run out of time, you still lose the game, which is a bit unfair. Ripley is armed with a pulse rifle, grenade launcher, flamethrower and hand grenades, which are handy for exploding aliens below you on a ladder or in the air vents, and you would face up against a Guardian, a big alien, to serve as a boss encounter. The graphics are slick for the time and well animated. The music by Matt Furniss is incredible, catchy, memorable tunes that don't capture the movie's score but do create a great atmosphere to the game. Plus you have some bass rumbling sound effects. Hearing the aliens explode sound fantastic. Outside of just saving the prisoners and battling the boss aliens, it does begin to get a bit boring after say 30 minutes. It's all trial and error finding the prisoners. The motion tracker is there to help, but you barely pay any attention to it, so the repetitive nature of the game begins to lose its appeal. In summary, it's a great looking and sounding game that is fun in short bursts, but proves tiresome after a while. The Mega Drive game would get a lot of press back when the video game magazine market was oversaturated. Every multi-format or dedicated Sega publication covered it, plus the game was even reviewed on the popular video game show Games Master, and was even featured as a challenge for contestants. The majority of the magazines gave it strong reviews, with the highest from Megatech at 94%, saying it was the best action game to ever grace the Mega Drive, despite not being a true translation of the film. But some were less impressed, with Mega Drive Advanced Gaming awarding it 62%, complaining of the sluggish controls and complete lack of originality. Other magazines followed suit with their praise, like Megatech, with Sega Power giving it 82%, CVG 90% and Sega Force with 92%. It was clear Probe had a winner on their hands, and despite the massive changes from the movie, gamers didn't care, and it became a popular title on the Mega Drive. The Master System version was released exclusively in Europe in December 1992, as the US market had all but dried up in 1991, but the aging console still had life in Europe and in particular South America. The 8-bit version would make use of the game engine Probe had used for their other licensed title, Home Alone, so the player has a wider playing field to see the aliens advancing or when they leap to attack. Playing very much like its bigger brother, the Mega Drive, the player starts out with no ammo this time, but you quickly find supplies and work your way through the level saving the prisoners. There are less alien sprites on screen, making the game easier, and the prisoners are placed in different areas to the Mega Drive version, often bunched up together. Due to the Master System's controller only having 2 buttons, you have to hold down button 2 and press down to change weapons. You don't have to open doors manually, instead they will open automatically. The most frustrating element of the game is controlling Ripley, who has this annoying jumping method, which when hopping over holes you always leap at the same distance, so timing your jumps is frustrating, and with it being designed as a platformer, there are many moments throughout the game you have to leap correctly onto moving platforms or avoid those rotating air blades. The Master System and Game Gear versions would have an exclusive animated cutscene, as an alien appears on screen in the foreground, and in the background you can see Ripley looking more like Jason from Friday the 13th as she shoots the xenomorph. This little sequence appears to have changed from its original design. Published in an Amiga magazine in June of 1992, it appears that the asset was intended for the Amiga version, but it would be dropped and put into the 8-bit Sega versions. Gaming journalists were again pretty positive, though complaints of the game's music was a common talking point, with Sega Pro awarding it 90%, saying brilliant fun all the way through, you'd be stupid to miss this one, a good all-rounder for everyone. But Sega Power were less impressed, giving it 72%, saying a marginally good effort for the old 8-bit Master System, a little bit easier than the Mega Drive version, but well worth dipping into your pockets anyway. The Game Gear version would be identical to the Master System version, but would have the aspect ratio of the game zoomed in to fit within the Game Gear's resolution and screen size. Being pretty much the same game as the Master System version, the reviews would reflect similar scores, with Megaplay strangely having 2 ratings from 2 of the critics with 69% and 78%, with both their write-ups being very positive. The scoring ultimately made no sense. Sega Pro would give it a stronger review with 88%, saying Alien 3 is packed with action and includes a slight strategy element, which is the perfect recipe for a game of this genre. Mean Machine Sega went a few percentage higher, giving it 90%, with Paul Davis saying, "It's astonishing how close this version of the Mega Drive hit is to the original. The gameplay is almost identical, the differences are so slight they are hardly worth mentioning, and the action remains exactly the same." The Nintendo version would again follow the style of the other Sega versions, but would appear very different visually with smaller sprites, larger levels, and looking very different with its layouts, taking on its own design, feeling more removed from the original Mega Drive game, but it retains similar gameplay. Despite less aliens to battle with and prisoners to save, you are limited by a strict timer to save them all, again trial and error to find these guys. Oddly, the weapons all seem to dish out the same amount of damage. Aliens hide in the ceilings and can catch you unawares, as the tiny sprite of them waiting is often too hard to spot. Controlling Ripley for using the ladders is a little more fiddly, and jumping seems more precise in this version as Ripley doesn't leap that far. With most NES licensed games, the coders would often throw in cutscenes to help tell the story, but not for this one. It's very much title screen, press start, and away you go. Once completed, it brings over the same bland ending as with all the other Probe games. Jerome Tell provides a catchy soundtrack to the game, but it doesn't match the quality of his work he provided on Robocop 3. The reviews were again strong for the NES version. N-Force gave it an overall score of 84%, writing, "There's no sprite flicker and screen corruption, so the backgrounds, which are given real attention, can be properly appreciated. Although the controls are smooth and responsive, I had a few problems navigating the various mazes. Don't expect to be able to just pick it up and complete it in a few hours." Total Magazine gave it a slightly higher score of 86%, saying Alien 3 may not be a non-stop blaster, but what it lacks in action it makes up for intense, edge-of-the-seat excitement. It's great to play and you never know what's lurking around the corner. The Amiga version would arrive on 2 floppy disks, looking pretty much like the Mega Drive version, though it doesn't run as smoothly. The background assets aren't as detailed, and you can't have the music and sound effects on at the same time, and have to toggle between the two on the options menu. Though with the music on, it's no patch on the Mega Drive tunes. On the plus side, it's one of the few Amiga games to support a 2-button joystick. When it came to reviews of Alien 3 on the Amiga, which were genuinely positive, the magazines didn't review it all at once, and there were reports of it being pirated months before its official release. CU Amiga reviewed it in December 1992, highlighting "We've got the scoop" review, awarding it 92%, saying it has all the atmosphere of an Aliens film, as you never know when one's going to leap out at you. This is one of the best movie-to-game conversions I've seen. 2 months later, Games Master would only preview it in February 93, and Amiga Power would actually review it that month, awarding it 85%. Amiga Format would review it in April, awarding it 70%, saying, "The whole game seems as though it has been rushed out to meet a tight deadline, which is a real shame because with a relatively small amount of work, it could have been a great shoot 'em up. There was a great game in there somewhere, but faced with a lack of variety, sound and overall atmosphere, it just won't leap out and grab you." And finally, Amiga Computing would eventually review it in June, giving it 85%. So, its release date is a bit unsure, but also did CU Amiga review an unfinished version. Something funny is going on here. The Game Boy version, thanks to its changing gameplay style, going for a top-down Zelda-like game, is a breath of fresh air, compared to the side-scrolling action of the Sega titles. The graphics are generally pretty basic, with the characters looking like stickmen along with Ripley. Aside from that basic approach, the level design is detailed, and it includes cutscenes between the characters from the film, with the Warden Andrews, Bishop, Ripley and Dylan, taking dialogue directly from the script. Ripley must explore the prison facility while solving puzzles and battling xenomorphs, facehuggers, and eventually the Queen alien. Only after destroying the Queen and her eggs, Ripley can now activate the crashed escape pod with the help of Bishop to leave the planet. Wait, what? Oh, the game was so close to being like the movie with its story until it screwed it up by the end. Aside from the odd ending, the game is pure class, very addictive and a great change of pace. It's not something you would probably return to after completing it, but a solid experience nonetheless. Nintendo Game Zone magazine awarded it 84%. What we have here is a rip-roaring tie-in of rare spankiness. Spankiness? That's a bit weird. To be cherished and mulled over with loving care. If only the actual film were as good. Nintendo Magazine System gave it a whopping score of 90%. Saying, "It's a funny old world, isn't it? Alien 3 the film was really not very good, but yielded a lot of smart console conversions, a feat rarely achieved by far better films. This is one of the more enjoyable and inventive games released in a particularly good season for Game Boy titles." To many people's surprise, Alien 3 would hit the Commodore 64 on cassette in October/November of 1993. It nearly never got released, and was one of the last games to be published for the aging computer. Released just over a year after the launch of the Sega Mega Drive version, Probe Entertainment was very familiar with the aging C64 hardware, so everything that is in the other ports would be featured on the C64, including 15 stages, an options menu, a full ending, and accurate graphics that seem to capture the 16-bit hardware, but of course with limitations, and the prisoners don't seem to have their full bodies, only appearing from the waist up. But you could have the sound effects and music on at the same time, unlike the Amiga port. Points there for the C64. A mightily impressive conversion, and the reviews were strong, with Commodore Format awarding it 93%, saying Alien 3 proves the old 64 can still mix with the best of them. Commodore Format was less enthusiastic, awarding it 78%. Alien 3 is nothing outrageously special, the gameplay is fairly standard, and all the levels are very similar indeed. What's more, it's also a bit too easy. But don't write it off just yet, the action is actually well paced, and the way the time limits are set really does add to the tension. The Super Nintendo version had a lengthy development time, arriving in June 1993. The coders would take a similar approach to the Sega versions, but expanded the gameplay by offering other missions outside of just saving the prisoners. You could steal doors, restore power, or have orders to destroy a hive of alien eggs and clear rooms. It would feature additional cutscenes to set up the story of the film, as Ripley crash lands on Fury 161. But outside of that, it shifts in its own direction to become an action game, with boss battles with a giant alien that replicates the look of the one featured in the film, and these encounters with these boss aliens would happen a few times. As the game ends, you do sacrifice yourself into the molten steel to kill the alien queen, which is the only game which stays faithful to the actual movie's finale. There is a big shift in quality in the graphics front compared to the Mega Drive, the level design is more faithful to the set design of the movie, and the music takes on a more orchestral approach, which is more threatening and atmospheric, but does sound a bit muddy and compressed, along with the sound effects, which aren't as meaty as the Sega Mega Drive counterpart. The game does get very difficult, as the aliens begin to take on more damage before they are killed, with the flamethrower needing to be upgraded, but if you accidentally pick up weaker fuel for the thrower, it becomes tough to reduce the amount of aliens on screen, which can swarm you with facehuggers, little baby aliens and the full-size ones, causing much frustration. Once you've experienced all the various missions, it begins to get very repetitive like the Mega Drive game, and it becomes more of a chore as you get to stage 3 onwards. It's not a short game by any means, and can take around 5 hours to complete, unlike the Mega Drive game which can be completed in an hour or so. Plus the Sega game is a lot more speedy, as the SNES version feels sluggish in comparison, and the floaty jumping can be annoying at times, especially when trying to jump over facehuggers who will jump at the same time, knocking you back. But this does give you a lot of freedom to take on the missions in any order, so it doesn't feel so linear, which was very refreshing for the time. Despite being released over a year after the film's release, the film was now on home video to rent and buy, so there was still a lot of interest in Alien 3, and the SNES game would highly impress the gaming journalists, getting high marks across the board. Total Magazine awarded it 90%, saying Alien 3 is the best SNES movie license ever. CVG gave it 94%, with journalist Paul Rand saying, graphically gorgeous and sonically far superior to a lot of current SNES outpourings. Alien 3 captures the atmosphere of the film, and then some. In short, it's a smash. And Nintendo Magazine System also gave it 94%, saying at last, a film license which actually lives up to its potential. Alien 3 is quite simply the best game to emerge from acclaim for ages, and a brilliant example of just how good a film license can be. And finally we have Alien 3 The Gun from Sega, who obtained the license to produce an arcade game making use of their System 32 hardware. Sega's first 32-bit system, and their final major sprite-based board. Other games around this time that used this hardware was Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, and the following year another light gun shooter, Jurassic Park. The game in 1 or 2 player has you control colonial marines as you start out on the Sulaco and battle a super facehugger. You land on Fury 161 to wipe out the alien infestation and save survivors. You travel from the crash point of Ripley's evac ship into the prison. Once inside, the developers make good efforts to capture the production design from the hall, kitchen and corridors that lead to the lead works as you drop the hot lead on the alien and then finish it off. Then you come face to face with the human bishop, who attacks you. Once defeated, the Weyland-Yutani Marines come in and kill you. Oh, that's a shame. The game tells the story at the beginning with some 2D animated sequences, but for the majority of it, it makes use of digital still frames from the movie to continue the story, very much like the T2 arcade game. Released in late 1992, around October-November, it was apparently very popular in Japan on launch, but stateside, industry magazines Replay and Play Meter gave it little coverage, with a couple of mentions that it was coming out, but over the course of the next few months, the arcade didn't make it into the top 10 most played arcades. Playing the game via emulation and only playing it once in the arcade, the game is brutally tough and you can go through your credits very quickly. Also, with it being a light gun game, the cost of playing these were a bit more than your standard game like Street Fighter 2. So with the tough difficulty and cost of play, I think many gamers didn't continue to play it after their initial go, but then again, T2 Arcade was tough and a coin muncher, and that was very popular, so it's really hard to know why it didn't make an appearance in the US arcade charts, because most people who played it were wowed by the graphics and intense gameplay, and the gun itself you had to use was pretty cool. The game was never ported to any console and remained in the arcades. I think the Sega Saturn could have done a good job of replicating it, but it would have seemed too late to bring over a game based on a movie that was more than 3 years old at that point. When it comes to the games based on Alien 3, you are in pretty safe hands across the board for the various platforms. None of them are bad or unplayable. They all have a strong presentation for their dedicated formats. Of course, some are better than others and are closer to capturing the film's bleak story of Ripley's remaining days, but even the ones that stick close to the film still take many liberties. The developers were restricted on what they could do, but also didn't have the foresight to know that an Alien game featuring only one xenomorph could be achieved with the likes of Alien Isolation. Probably the best licensed game ever produced, but this was the early 90s, with game devs having less resources at their disposal, tight deadlines, and being too creative could be problematic, and playing it safe was the easiest option to please the license holder and heads of the studio to maximise their profits. My first experience with the game was with the Mega Drive version, which I loved and I'm very nostalgic for despite the issues I have with it. But what was interesting to me was reading the reviews at the time. Most of the gaming journalists commented on how they were disappointed with the movie but really enjoyed the games that would come out, so it left me with low expectations before I saw the film. When I eventually did see it, I really enjoyed it. It's obviously not to the standards of the previous two. I became more fascinated with its production and how it changed from its original conception, so I have a lot of time for the film and still go back to it. Out of all the games, I personally think the Mega Drive game is probably the most one people are familiar with, as with the other games were pretty much the same on the Master System, Game Gear, NES, Commodore 64 and Amiga. The Mega Drive port is fast paced, action heavy, great sound effects and music, but ultimately pretty shallow, as its maze-like levels become a source of frustration trying to find the prisoners before the time runs out, and it rinses and repeats to the end. The Game Boy version is one of the key standouts as it strives to offer something different, and though it doesn't flex the handheld's power too much, as it's pretty basic, but it thankfully offers something more to the player than just shooting things. Of course, the arcade wins on the graphics front, which is no surprise, and it has loads of nice touches that captures key moments from the movie, especially raining hot lead on the alien, but it's brutal with its difficulty. I suppose the Super Nintendo version is probably the best to offer a decent balance of quality graphics, varied gameplay and bang for your buck. So I would personally recommend Alien 3 on the Game Boy, Mega Drive and SNES, as each one offers enough variety for the player to sink their teeth into, or just for a quick play to get that hit of nostalgia. The arcade version would be on the list, as it is undoubtedly fun to play, but it's not easy to emulate perfectly, and if you don't have any light guns that are compatible, it takes away a lot of its appeal. Despite the film not appealing to many at the time, thankfully the developers at Probe had the foresight to take what they needed and added their own spin on it, to deliver what gamers wanted at the time, giving them the aesthetic of Alien 3, but with the action of aliens. And it was definitely a winning formula. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to click the like button and hit the bell to be notified of my latest reviews. Big thanks to my patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain access to exclusive videos and take part in Q&As, follow the link below.